Hi, Misha here, and last time we talked about the Valentine tank. Before that, we talked about the Matilda, and we started the whole series off talking about the very famous Churchill. Those were all infantry tanks, the larger, heavier, heavy armor, heavier gun, at least in theory, versions compared with cruisers. Well, this today is kind of the culmination of that whole series. Behold the Nuffield heavy assault tank Tortoise, also known as the A39. And this was really its own classification, or a new classification. By 1943, Britain and the Allies were at least on the right track to going on the offensive. And they knew that Germany had had years to fortify Europe, hence the whole Fortress Europe thing. And many thought that it would be much like World War I, where you have fixed fortifications that would have to be attacked and just slogging it out, the Siegfried Line and what have you. So that spring, a request specifications for something like this came about. Essentially, speed, maneuverability, that didn't matter. What mattered, it needed to have a big gun able to attack enemy tanks, sure, but mainly knock out heavily fortified installations, concrete, rebar, all that good stuff. And also be able to take a buttload of shells itself. So armor was the name of the game. Yeah. And one of the earliest examples of what could have been was the Excelsior, the A33. This took elements of the Churchill and the Cromwell to become a super heavy tank or assault gun. Later, the Valiant would be created, the A38, kind of using the Valentine as a basis. But really the company that seemed to really want this was Nuffield. Beginning in 1943, running through early 1944, they submitted no fewer than 18 designs, all entitled AT for Assault Tank 1 through 18. I think eventually they just wore the War Office, the ministry down. Eventually they selected AT-16. And they didn't actually even want a prototype. They just placed an order for 25. Now, this was not supposed to be a mainline infantry vehicle. They knew it was a special purpose, special task vehicle, and they would never need a whole lot. So they ordered 25, with deliveries expected by September of 1945. That kind of tells you, even in early 44, prior to D-Day, they weren't sure how the war was going to go. But this was meant for the European theater. It would not have done too great in the Pacific. So Nuffield would build these throughout 1944 and 45. But of course, in May, the war would end. Now, the project wasn't canned altogether, but the order was reduced. In fact, ultimately, they would build half a dozen, 6 of these, with a couple delivered in 45 and the rest delivered in 1946. So what do we have here aside from a very odd-looking tank? This model is 1/72 scale die-cast from Panzerkampf, and they're one of those companies that they're kind of hit or miss, but this one's pretty neat. It's actually quite heavy and mostly all metal, probably thanks to its size. Lengthwise, it's not huge. Even with the big gun, it's only about 33 feet. The main body is about 23 feet, so not a whole lot different than a modern main battle tank or universal tank. But weight-wise, even by modern standards, she's heavy. 78 tons. By World War II standards, it was virtually unheard of. There were only a couple of other Allied vehicles heavier than this, and they weren't even produced past the prototype stage like this was, at least. Most all of its weight was from the armor and the armament. The armor, well, it was heavy. Anywhere from 178 millimeters up to nearly 230. So we're talking 7 to 9 inches of armor. And the thickest armor is, of course, the front plate, but the casemate here, where the gun is housed, it's pretty thick. It's about 220, 225, so it's right in there. And it's actually formed from a single casting, which there's always going to be heavier, but that's to just make it seamless, literally. And they did not go with the traditional turret because they didn't want the weaknesses of a turret. They didn't want it to be able to get jammed. And this isn't a traditional casemate either. It actually has quite a bit of traverse, about 40 degrees, and it can be elevated and depressed about 20 degrees up and about 10 degrees down. So for a casemate, that's pretty flexible. Now the gun itself, this is a QF 32 pounder. This is a 94 millimeter bore gun, and it was based on the 3.7 inch anti-aircraft gun. Basically, the Brits saw how well the Germans turned the 8.8 centimeter gun into a tank, anti-tank gun, and so they did the same with their own anti-aircraft gun. It's big, and has quite good range and penetration. For defense, it had one 7.9 millimeter Beza machine gun in the front, kind of in a little mini turret or ball mount, and then on the top we have two more 7.9 machine guns in kind of a cupola mount for defense. So, pretty well armed, all things considered. 3 machine guns were pretty unheard of in World War II. The main gun, it actually used a 2-part charge system, a projectile and a separate charge, something later British tanks would use. There were 60 rounds usually carried, although only about a dozen were ready to go at any given time. The rest were stored, kind of all over the tank. This used the same basic Meteor engine that was gasoline powered as many other British tanks. But because of its weight and size, it could only get up to about 12 miles per hour, and that was on-road. Off-road, that could decrease to 4 miles per hour. The good news is it could go nearly as fast in reverse, which is actually advantageous for an assault vehicle like this. And it could drink over 500 gallons and only get about 85 to 90 miles on that. So fuel efficiency, not so much. And had a crew of 7. You had your commander, of course. You had your gunner. You had 2 loaders. You had the machine gunner. And you had a driver and co-driver, or just 2 drivers, if you will. That meant to operate the top machine guns, probably the co-driver would have. We're not really sure because this never really saw combat as such. But it at least did make it off the drawing board and was built. In fact, it was sent over to occupied Germany. Some sources say in 1945, some say in 1946. We don't know how many went. Probably more than one. Probably not a lot more, though. And they tested them. Of course, they tested them against captured German armored vehicles, including Panthers. They found out that this gun was actually very accurate and could punch through a Panther at about 1,000 yards, 1,000 meters. Not too shabby. But And surprisingly, for as crazy as this design is, it was actually pretty reliable. You would think maybe something would be a little wonky, like with the transmission, but not really. But its weight was its major detraction. Not only the lack of fuel efficiency, range, and all that, but how are you going to get this around? It's hard to drive it on its own power because it's going to require so much gas. But to get it anywhere, you have to have a couple of specialized vehicles, and it won't fit on standard rail and all that good stuff. In addition, it's really too big and heavy to go across a lot of European bridges, including the kind of temporary bridges that the UK military was using at the time. So, yeah, they literally did use these to test if a bridge was stable or not. I guess that would have been an interesting ride. So it was hard to transport. But the funny thing is, this is what we saw with a lot of the late war massive German vehicles like the Maus or the later Tiger variants. It was created for something that just didn't exist. If Germany had massive dug-in and heavily armored fortifications, this might have been useful. It was at least dependable, had a good gun, but that's just not how the war went. And I have to wonder how vulnerable it would be to aircraft if it had to, defend against those. Kind of seems less than, yeah. Now, by this time, the concept of the universal or main battle tank was coming into vogue. It hadn't really been coined yet as such, but with the Centurion and the T-54 and eventually the M60 and all that, it would become a thing throughout the late 40s and 50s. So specialized heavy assault vehicles like this just weren't needed. Neither were light tanks. Again, the MBT kind of replaced so many things on the battlefield, and almost by accident. It should be said that this is classed as a tank, but you could easily be forgiven for considering it an assault gun, a piece of mobile artillery. It's much too slow and heavy to be an anti-tank or tank destroyer, of course, though. But I normally don't get into prototypes, but this is just too weird and cool. And it is kind of a capper to that whole line of British tanks. And actually, next time, we will go back to the beginning, or nearly so. But with that, I do appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could, please like, share, subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.